A 67-year-old grandmother sat on a concrete bench outside an Oklahoma hospital long after midnight. Most people never looked at her twice. A visitor walked past carrying flowers. A nurse hurried through the sliding doors. A security guard glanced in her direction before continuing his rounds. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked questions. Nobody seemed curious about why the same woman appeared outside the hospital every night. Mirabel pulled a worn blanket tighter around her shoulders and adjusted the small bag resting beside her feet. A man leaving the hospital slowed down just enough to shake his head. "Ma'am, you know it's too cold to be sleeping out here, right?" Mirabel looked up and smiled. "Baby, I'm not camping." The man frowned. Mirabel pointed toward the hospital entrance. "Camping comes with marshmallows and people pretending mosquitoes. Our part of nature." The man laughed despite himself. "You always got jokes?" "Only when life starts acting expensive." The man chuckled and continued walking. Mirabel watched him leave before her smile faded. For a few seconds she stared at the hospital doors, not with anger, not with bitterness, with worry, the kind of worry that refuses to let a person rest. Inside the hospital, several floors above the entrance, Dr. Jeremiah stood near a window finishing paperwork after another exhausting shift. He glanced down toward the entrance. His eyes immediately found the familiar figure. Mirabel, again, the same blanket, the same bag, the same bench. For a moment, he stopped reading. A strange feeling settled over him. He had seen her on Monday. He had seen her on Thursday. He had seen her during rain. He had seen her before sunrise. He had seen her after midnight. And now he was seeing her again. Dr. Jeremiah frowned. How long has she been out there? He quietly tried to remember. 1 week? 2? His expression changed. No, longer, much longer. The realization hit him harder than expected. Mirabel had become so familiar to the hospital that people barely noticed her anymore, like part of the building, like part of the sidewalk, like part of the night itself. But for the first time, Dr. Jeremiah could not stop looking, because something about Mirabel told him she wasn't waiting for charity. She was waiting for something else, something important, something worth sleeping outside a hospital for. And before morning arrived, he was finally going to ask why. Dear God, thank you for bringing us together today. As we listen to this story, help us remember that every person carries a struggle we may not see. Teach us kindness, compassion, and understanding. Open our hearts to the people who need encouragement and remind us never to judge too quickly. Bless everyone watching, and may this story leave us wiser, stronger, and more grateful. Amen. Welcome to Love, Money, and Secret, where America's greatest stories and life lessons meet creativity and heart. If you're new to the family, we're grateful to have you here. Before we continue, please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Those simple actions help. YouTube, share these stories with more people, and they help our family continue growing every day. The hospital clock showed 3:07 a.m. Most of Oklahoma was asleep. The waiting rooms had grown quieter. The hallways had fewer footsteps. Even the emergency entrance had slowed down. Dr. Jeremiah should have been heading home. Instead, he found himself standing near the same window again, looking down, looking at Mirabel. She was still there. The blanket covered her legs. The small bag rested beside her. Her head leaned against the wall behind the bench. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that disappears after a night's sleep. The kind that settles deep into a person's bones. Dr. Jeremiah grabbed his coat. A few minutes later, the hospital doors opened. Cold air rushed inside. Mirabel looked up as he stepped outside. She immediately noticed the white coat beneath his jacket. "Well, look at that," she said. "A doctor escaped." Dr. Jeremiah couldn't help smiling. "Is that what happened?" "Either that or you're avoiding paperwork." "Trust me, there's plenty of paperwork waiting for me." Mirabel nodded. "Now that sounds believable." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was curious, like two people standing near a question neither had answered yet. Finally, Dr. Jeremiah looked directly at her. "Ma'am." Mirabel raised an eyebrow. "Yes, doctor?" He hesitated, not because he didn't know what to ask, because he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Still, he asked anyway. "Why are you still here?" The joke disappeared from Mirabel's face. So did the smile. Her eyes slowly moved toward the hospital building, toward the windows glowing against the darkness, toward the place she had been watching for weeks. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, very quiet, yet it landed harder than anything Dr. Jeremiah had heard all night. "Because the only person I got left is breathing inside that building." Everything around him seemed to stop. Dr. Jeremiah stared at her. Mirabel didn't look away. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply spoke the truth. The truth she had been carrying every night on that bench. The truth nobody had bothered to ask about. For the first time, Dr. Jeremiah realized he had been wrong. Mirabel wasn't outside the hospital because she wanted attention. She wasn't there because she was causing trouble. She wasn't there because she had nowhere else to be. She was standing guard, protecting someone she loved, and suddenly Dr. Jeremiah needed to know everything. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. And tell us honestly, have you ever judged someone before knowing their story? Sometimes the people we overlook are carrying the greatest burdens. Sometimes the strongest love is the kind nobody notices. And Mirabel's story is only beginning. Before Mirabel ever slept outside that Oklahoma hospital, she was known in her neighborhood as the grandmother who could make people laugh even when her own refrigerator was nearly empty. Every Sunday morning she walked into church with her head high, her Bible tucked under one arm, and a smile that made people think life had been kinder to her than it really was. One woman once whispered, "Mirabel, how do you keep smiling with everything you carry?" Mirabel adjusted her glasses and said, "Baby, if I cry too long, my bills might think they won." That was Mirabel. Funny, proud, faithful, and stubborn in the way only a woman who had survived hard seasons could be. She lived in a small place on the older side of town, where neighbors checked on each other, children still got corrected by adults who were not their parents, and church folks believed food tasted better when shared. Mirabel did not have much, but people respected her because she never treated poverty like an excuse to lose manners. If she had one can of beans, she would stretch it. If someone needed prayer, she gave it. If a child walked past looking hungry, she would call out, "Come here, baby. I got something small, but small food still counts when your stomach is arguing." But Mirabel hated pity. One afternoon, a church member tried to press money into her hand. Mirabel gently pushed it back. "Don't sneak charity on me like I'm not standing right here," she said. "It's just help. Help is fine. Pity wears too much perfume." The woman laughed, but Mirabel meant every word. She believed dignity was one of the few things life had no right to steal. Still, life kept pressing harder. Her monthly check never stretched far enough. Rent came like it had an attitude. Food prices climbed. Medicine cost more than she expected. Bus fare became something she had to plan carefully. Some days, Mirabel would sit at her kitchen table with bills spread in front of her and say, "Lord, I know you can multiply loaves and fish, but these utility bills are asking for a whole miracle." Even with all that, she refused to let bitterness raise its voice louder than faith. She sang in church. She greeted neighbors. She kept her clothes clean. She laughed when her heart was tired, because to Mirabel, dignity was not about having money. It was about refusing to let hardship make you forget who you were. And that strong spirit was the same spirit that would later carry her to the hospital doors, not for herself, for love. Life did not become difficult for Mirabel all at once. It happened little by little. One problem arrived, then another, then another. Before long, she found herself spending more energy solving problems than enjoying her days. The first issue was transportation. The Oklahoma bus routes she depended on became less reliable for the places she needed to reach. Miss one connection, and hours could disappear. Mirabel often joked about it. One morning, after waiting far longer than expected, she shook her head and said, "This bus and I are in a relationship. The problem is only one. Of us knows when we're meeting." The people nearby laughed. Mirabel laughed too, but underneath the joke was frustration. Transportation was becoming harder. Everything took longer. Everything cost more. Then housing became uncertain. Rent increased again. The numbers simply stopped making sense. Mirabel spent evenings calculating expenses and crossing things off her budget. Sometimes it was a meal. Sometimes it was medicine. Sometimes it was something else she needed. The choices became harder every month. Still, she refused to complain publicly. Whenever someone asked how she was doing, she answered the same way. "Still standing, baby." That answer hid more than people realized. As the months passed, Mirabel found herself making more trips to the Oklahoma hospital. What started as occasional visits gradually became part of her routine. Some days she arrived early, some days she stayed late. Sometimes she remained long after visiting hours ended. People inside the hospital began recognizing her face. A nurse might see her in the morning. A visitor might see her again that evening. A security guard might notice her the next day. Soon, many people thought they understood her situation. The problem was that most of them were wrong. Some assumed she wanted attention. Others assumed she was simply waiting for assistance. A few believed she had given up on finding a better situation. Nobody bothered asking. It was easier to create a story than learn the truth. Mirabel noticed the looks. She noticed the whispers. She noticed people making decisions about her without speaking to her. So she did what she always did. She protected her pride with humor. One afternoon, someone asked if she practically lived at the hospital. Mirabel smiled. Practically. Baby, if I lived here, I'd be asking where my employee discount is. The person laughed. Mirabel laughed too. The joke did its job. It kept people comfortable. It kept questions away. Most importantly, it hid the reason she kept returning. Because every trip to that hospital carried a purpose nobody around her understood. And before long, that purpose would place Mirabel on a bench outside the building night after night, where one doctor would finally notice what everyone else had missed. Long before Dr. Jeremiah walked outside at 3:07 in the morning, he had already spent years learning how to stay calm during other people's emergencies. At the Oklahoma hospital, people trusted him. Patients respected him. Staff listened when he spoke. When difficult situations appeared, Dr. Jeremiah was usually the person others looked toward. He had earned that reputation through discipline. He arrived early. He stayed late. He followed routines. He solved problems. Most people would have described him as successful. And they would have been right. At 40 years old, Dr. Jeremiah had a respected career, a comfortable home, and a life many people admired from a distance. The problem was that admiration could not keep a house from feeling empty. Most evenings followed the same pattern. He drove home after long shifts. He unlocked the front door. He ate dinner alone. He reviewed notes for the next day. Sometimes the television played in the background. Sometimes the house remained completely silent. Either way, nobody was waiting for him. Nobody asked how his day had gone. Nobody filled the rooms with conversation. Over time, he had become used to it. Or at least he told himself he had. His life worked efficiently. It simply did not feel very warm. One evening after finishing another shift, Dr. Jeremiah stood near a hospital window looking down toward the entrance. That was when he noticed her again. Mirabel, the older woman with the blanket, the same woman he had seen several times before. She sat outside watching the building. Not begging, not bothering anyone, just watching. The sight stayed with him longer than expected. The next evening, he saw her again. A few days later, he noticed her once more. Then again. Then again. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Dr. Jeremiah found himself looking toward the entrance almost automatically. If Mirabel was there, he noticed. If she was not there, he noticed that too. One night, he caught himself doing exactly that and shook his head. "What is it about her?" he quietly asked. He did not have an answer. All he knew was that something felt different. Most people sitting outside the hospital eventually moved on. Mirabel never seemed to. She arrived, she waited, she watched, and somehow, without speaking more than a few words to him, she had become the one person in the entire hospital Dr. Jeremiah could not stop thinking about. As the days passed, Dr. Jeremiah began noticing something unexpected. Mirabel was not just sitting outside the hospital. She was paying attention to people. She noticed when someone looked worried. She noticed when someone looked exhausted. She noticed when someone needed a smile. One evening, Dr. Jeremiah stepped outside after a long shift and found Mirabel sitting on her usual bench. She looked up immediately. "There he is." Dr. Jeremiah smiled slightly. "Who?" "The doctor who walks around looking like he personally owes sleep money." For the first time that day, he laughed. "I don't look that tired." Mirabel stared at him for a second. "Baby, if you get any more tired, they're going to admit you into your own hospital." Dr. Jeremiah shook his head. "You always talk to strangers like this?" "Only the grumpy ones." That conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but somehow he found himself smiling all the way back inside. A few nights later, it happened again. Dr. Jeremiah exited the building carrying a cup of coffee. Mirabel pointed toward it. "That your first cup today?" "No." "Second?" "No." "Third?" Dr. Jeremiah hesitated. Mirabel nodded knowingly. "That's what I thought. It was a long day." "That's doctor language for I've made coffee my entire personality." Again, he laughed. Again, the conversation stayed with him longer than it should have. The strange thing was that Mirabel never asked him for anything. Not money, not favors, not sympathy. She simply talked to him. Like he was a person instead of a title. Inside the hospital, everyone knew him as Dr. Jeremiah. Outside, Mirabel treated him like Jeremiah. The difference mattered more than he wanted to admit. As the weeks continued, their brief conversations became part of his routine. A joke, a greeting, a short exchange before he returned to work. Nothing important. At least that was what he kept telling himself. Yet curiosity kept growing. Why was she always there? Why did she spend so many nights outside? Why did she watch the building the way other people watch loved ones? Most importantly, why did she never leave? The question followed him through hallways. It followed him through patient rounds. It followed him home. One night, after another long shift, Dr. Jeremiah stood near the hospital, window again. Mirabel was still outside. The blanket, the bag, the bench, exactly where she always seemed to be, He stared for several seconds. Then he made a decision. Tomorrow he would stop wondering. Tomorrow he would stop guessing. Tomorrow he would finally walk outside and ask the question nobody else seemed interested in asking. Why are you here? And that decision would change both of their lives. The decision Dr. Jeremiah made that night followed him until the end of his shift. For weeks he had watched. For weeks he had wondered. Now he finally stood outside the hospital with the question resting between them. Mirabel sat quietly on the bench. The humor she usually carried had faded. Not disappeared, just stepped aside. Dr. Jeremiah looked at her. Why are you still here? Mirabel's eyes moved toward the hospital building. For several seconds she said nothing. Dr. Jeremiah did not rush her. Whatever answer she carried had clearly been heavy for a long time. Finally she spoke. Because the only person I got left is breathing inside that building. The words landed harder than he expected. Dr. Jeremiah glanced toward the hospital entrance. You have family inside? Mirabel nodded. For the first time since he had met her, her voice sounded tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. My grandchild. Dr. Jeremiah remained silent. Mirabel continued. Been inside a while now. Her eyes never left the building. Some days are better than others. What happened? Mirabel shook her head gently. Doctors are already handling that part. The answer wasn't rude. It was simply protective. Dr. Jeremiah respected that. He sat beside her. Not too close, just close enough to listen. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Mirabel quietly continued. I used to tell myself things would get easier. She laughed softly. Life heard me and took it personally. Dr. Jeremiah smiled despite the sadness in her voice. Mirabel looked down at her hands. Money disappeared fast. She shrugged. You miss enough work, skip enough meals, pay enough bills, and one day you wake up doing math you can't win. Dr. Jeremiah listened carefully. Mirabel wasn't asking for sympathy. She was explaining reality. The bus rides got harder. She nodded toward the road. Sometimes I'd spend more time getting here than sleeping. Dr. Jeremiah frowned. You travel back and forth every day? I tried. Tried? Mirabel gave a small smile. Eventually there wasn't much left to travel back to. The answer hit him immediately. Housing, instability, loss. The pieces started fitting together. What about relatives? Mirabel laughed once, not because anything was funny, because the answer was familiar. If family could solve this, I wouldn't be having this conversation at 3 a.m. Dr. Jeremiah lowered his eyes. The loneliness in that sentence felt enormous. For the first time, he truly understood what he was looking at. Not a woman waiting for handouts, not a woman causing trouble, not a woman seeking attention. He was looking at a grandmother carrying everything alone, and somehow still showing up every day, still showing up every night, still showing up when most people would have given up. The realization settled heavily inside him, but he could tell there was more, much more, and whatever Mirabel had not yet said was the reason she kept returning. Dr. Jeremiah could feel there was another truth sitting behind Mirabel's eyes. Not a small truth. A truth that had kept her on that bench when her body needed rest. He spoke gently. Mirabel, why stay outside all night? Mirabel rubbed her hands together, then looked toward the hospital in Dallas again. Because a promise don't stop counting just because life gets hard. Dr. Jeremiah stayed quiet. Mirabel swallowed. One night my grandchild got scared. Real scared. Her voice softened. Asked me if I was going home. Dr. Jeremiah's expression changed. Mirabel nodded slowly. I said, no, baby, Grandma won't leave. The words seemed simple, but Dr. Jeremiah heard everything inside them. Love, fear, sacrifice, exhaustion. Mirabel looked down at the blanket over her knees. I didn't know they wouldn't let me stay inside every night. I didn't know the bus money would run out. I didn't know my place would stop. Being mine? She gave a small laugh without joy. But I already gave my word. Dr. Jeremiah's voice came out low. So you stayed. I stayed. Every night. Every night I could. In the cold. Cold don't scare grandmothers. Bills scare us. Hospital calls scare us. A child asking where you are scares us. Dr. Jeremiah looked away for a moment. Mirabel continued. Some mornings I washed up where I could. Some days I ate crackers and called it brunch. Some nights I sat right here and prayed until my knees remembered they were old. A faint smile touched her face. My knee's been filing complaints for years. Dr. Jeremiah laughed softly, but his eyes were wet. Mirabel noticed and raised an eyebrow. Doctor, don't you start crying on me. I only got one blanket, and it is not rated for medical emotions. He wiped his face quickly and smiled. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Just listen. I am. She nodded. I never wanted anybody to pity me. I just wanted my grandchild to know somebody stayed, somebody kept showing up, somebody was close enough to pray, close enough to ask questions, close enough to be there if things changed. Dr. Jeremiah finally understood. Mirabelle was not outside because she was careless. She was not outside because she had given up. She was outside because love had placed her there. Love had kept her there. And every person who walked past her had missed the strongest thing about her. He looked at the hospital doors, then back at Mirabelle. You shouldn't have had to do this alone. Mirabelle held his gaze. No, but I did. That answer stayed between them. Not bitter, not dramatic, just true. Dr. Jeremiah stood slowly. Mirabelle watched him. Where are you going? To make sure you don't have to keep proving love from a bench. For once, Mirabelle had no joke ready. She only nodded, and Dr. Jeremiah walked back into the hospital carrying a promise of his own. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, what would you do for someone you love? Share this story with someone who needs to remember that love is not always loud. Sometimes love is quiet, tired, cold, and still faithful. After leaving Mirabelle outside the hospital that night, Dr. Jeremiah could not stop thinking about their conversation. He had spent years treating illnesses, years reviewing charts, years making decisions based on facts. But what he had learned from Mirabelle felt different. It was not a medical problem, it was a human one. The next day, between responsibilities, he quietly began asking questions, not gossip, not personal details, just enough to understand how a grandmother had ended up sleeping outside a hospital while trying to keep a promise. The answers bothered him more than he expected. The first thing he discovered was that Mirabelle had never broken any rules. She had never caused disruptions. She had never argued with staff. She had never demanded special treatment. In fact, many employees described her as polite, respectful, patient. That made everything harder to accept, because despite all of that, the system had still left her outside. Dr. Jeremiah learned that overnight accommodations inside the hospital were limited. Policies existed for a reason. Space was limited. Rules were followed. On paper, everything looked reasonable, but reality looked different. Reality looked like a grandmother sleeping on a bench. Reality looked like a promise being kept in the cold. The deeper he looked, the more pieces connected. Transportation had become a serious obstacle. The cost of traveling back and forth had drained what little resources Mirabelle had left. Each trip required choices. Food or transportation, rest or transportation, basic needs or transportation. Eventually, those choices became impossible. Then there was the financial reality. Dr. Jeremiah learned enough to understand what Mirabelle had meant. When she said life became expensive, everything cost money. Transportation, housing, food, medicine, the numbers added up faster than support arrived. The situation was not caused by one dramatic event. It was caused by many small hardships piling on top of each other until there was nowhere left to stand. Dr. Jeremiah sat quietly in his office after putting everything together. The frustration grew heavier with every detail, not anger toward a single person, anger toward a system that followed rules while missing the human being standing directly in front of it. Mirabelle had not been invisible because people hated her. She had been invisible because everyone assumed somebody else would help. And that realization stayed with Dr. Jeremiah long after the workday ended, because now that he knew the truth, doing nothing was no longer an option. The morning after learning the full truth, Dr. Jeremiah made a decision. If he was going to help Mirabelle, he would do it carefully, very carefully, because by now he understood something important about her. Mirabelle could survive hardship. What she could not tolerate was being treated like she had lost her dignity. Late that afternoon, Dr. Jeremiah found her sitting near the hospital entrance. She looked up and smiled. Well, if it isn't my favorite overworked doctor. Dr. Jeremiah sat beside her. You only know one doctor. Details, baby. Don't ruin my compliment. He laughed. For a moment, neither mentioned the conversation from the previous night. Then Dr. Jeremiah handed her a paper cup. Mirabelle looked at it suspiciously. What is this? Coffee. You sure? He raised an eyebrow. What else would it be? I don't know. Rich people put strange things in cups. You think doctors are rich? Mirabelle took a sip. No, I think doctors are tired. The answer made him laugh again. But this time he noticed something. The conversation felt easier, lighter. Not because Mirabelle's problems had disappeared, because she trusted him enough to be herself. Over the next several days, Dr. Jeremiah began helping in small ways, practical ways, respectful ways. He never placed money in her hand. He never treated her like a project. He never spoke to her as if she were helpless. Instead, he listened. He asked questions. He connected her with resources that already existed but had been difficult to reach, Each step was designed to solve a problem without damaging her pride. Mirabel noticed. One afternoon she looked at him carefully. You know why this works? Why? Because you don't talk to me like I'm broken. Dr. Jeremiah sat quietly. Mirabel continued. Most people see a blanket and start making assumptions. She pointed at herself. You see a person. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The words meant more to Dr. Jeremiah than she realized. Inside the hospital, changes began happening too. Not dramatic changes. Human changes. Staff members who had once walked past Mirabel started greeting her. Some stopped to ask how she was doing. Others offered kindness without making her feel small. The whispers disappeared. The judgment faded. People were finally seeing what Dr. Jeremiah had seen. Not a problem, not a burden, not a woman waiting for pity. A grandmother, a loyal grandmother. A woman who had sacrificed comfort, sleep, and stability because she loved someone more than herself. One evening, Mirabel noticed a few staff members waving as they entered the building. She smiled and shook her head. Look at that. What? I spent weeks becoming invisible. She watched the doors open and close. And now people remember I exist. Dr. Jeremiah looked at her. No. Mirabel turned toward him. You were never invisible. For the first time, Mirabel had no joke ready, and the warm silence that followed felt like the beginning of something. Neither of them expected. The first real change came quietly. No big announcement, no crowd, no loud celebration, just Dr. Jeremiah walking toward Mirabel with a softer expression than usual. Mirabel saw him coming and narrowed her eyes. Doctor, why you walking like you got good news but don't want to scare it away? Dr. Jeremiah stopped beside her. You read faces now? Baby, I read bills, bus schedules, hospital moods, and people who pretend they're not tired. Faces are easy, he smiled. This time the smile reached his eyes. Your grandchild had a better morning. Mirabel froze. The small joke she had been preparing disappeared from her mouth. Better how? Breathing easier, responding better, resting better. Mirabel pressed one hand to her chest. For a moment, she did not speak. Dr. Jeremiah waited. He had learned that Mirabel did not need people rushing her emotions. She needed room to feel them without being watched like a problem. Finally, she whispered, Thank you, Lord. Her eyes watered, but she held herself steady. Dr. Jeremiah sat beside her. Hope looks good on you. Mirabel turned toward him. Don't start complimenting me this early. I haven't had enough coffee to defend myself. I brought coffee. She looked at the cup in his hand. Now that is medical excellence. He handed it to her, and she accepted it with a small smile. Over the next few days, their conversations changed. They were no longer only about need, rules, or problems. Sometimes they talked about simple things: coffee, hospital food, sleep, faith, life. Mirabel teased him about his serious face. You ever practice smiling, doctor? I smile. At who? Medical equipment? He laughed. She liked that laugh. Not because it fixed anything, because it proved there was a man beneath the white coat who still knew how to feel something warm. Dr. Jeremiah began noticing the same thing about her. Mirabel had suffered, but hardship had not made her cruel. She could still laugh, still pray, still care, still notice when he looked exhausted. One evening, she held out her coffee cup and said, Sit down before. Your legs send in a resignation letter. He sat. The silence between them felt peaceful, not empty. Peaceful. Mirabel looked toward the hospital doors. I was scared to hope. Dr. Jeremiah spoke gently. Hope can feel risky. It can. But today it feels like God cracked a window. He nodded. For the first time in years, Dr. Jeremiah did not feel like he was simply leaving work late. He felt like he was staying because someone mattered. Mirabel turned to him with a soft smile. You're different from what I thought. What did you think? That you were all rules and no rhythm? He laughed. And now? Now I think you might have a little rhythm hiding somewhere. Their eyes held for a second longer than usual. Nothing rushed, nothing forced, just warmth, trust, a quiet beginning. And for Mirabel, that small beginning felt like one more sign that life had not finished being kind. The weeks that followed brought more good news than Mirabel had dared to expect. Not all at once, not like a miracle dropping from the sky, little by little, step by step. The first breakthrough came when stable housing support was finally approved. When Dr. Jeremiah told her, Mirabel stared at him for several seconds. You serious? I am an actual place? Yes. With walls? He laughed. Yes, Mirabel. Walls? A door? Yes. A bed? Yes. Mirabel placed a hand over her mouth. For once, words failed her. After everything she had endured, the idea of having a safe place again, felt almost unreal. The nights on the hospital bench finally came to an end. No more sleeping outside, no more pretending she was comfortable, no more waking up cold. For the first time in a long time, Mirabel had a place where she could rest. But the best news was still ahead. One afternoon, Dr. Jeremiah approached her with a smile she immediately recognized. It was the smile he wore when he was trying not to reveal something too quickly. Mirabel pointed at him. "There you go again? What? That face? What face? The face that says you're carrying good news around like a secret." His smile widened. "The recovery is going very well." Mirabel froze. Dr. Jeremiah continued. "Your grandchild is getting stronger." The words hit her harder than she expected. She sat down slowly. Not because she was weak, because relief suddenly weighed more than fear. For so long, every day had carried uncertainty. Now, for the first time, the future looked brighter. A few days later, the hospital organized a small gathering. Nothing elaborate, just a moment for staff to recognize something important. Mirabel arrived expecting very little. Dr. Jeremiah stood in front of the group. When he began speaking, the room became quiet. He looked directly at Mirabel. "I've spent years in this hospital." His voice was steady. "I've seen courage in many forms." Mirabel lowered her eyes. She already suspected where this was going. Dr. Jeremiah continued. "But one of the greatest examples of love I've ever witnessed wasn't inside a hospital room." The room remained silent. It was outside. Mirabel looked up. Dr. Jeremiah's eyes met hers. A grandmother kept showing up every day, every night, through hardship, uncertainty, and exhaustion. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone was rewarding her, because she made a promise. Mirabel felt tears gathering. Many of us walked past her before we understood her story. His voice softened, but her devotion reminded all of us what love really looks like. The room applauded. Mirabel covered her face. Not from embarrassment, from emotion. For weeks, people had seen a homeless woman. Now they saw her, truly saw her. When the gathering ended, she stood beside Dr. Jeremiah. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Mirabel smiled. "You know something? What?" "You turned out to be a pretty good doctor," he laughed. "Only pretty good?" "Don't get greedy." They both laughed. And standing there together, neither knew exactly what the future would become. But they knew this. It would be built on trust, on respect, on friendship, and on a kindness that had changed both of their lives forever. Sometimes the people sitting outside a building are not waiting for help. Sometimes they are keeping a promise. Sometimes they are protecting the only person they love. For weeks, people walked past Mirabel and assumed they understood her story. They saw a blanket, they saw hardship, they saw circumstances, but they never stopped long enough to see the heart behind them. Dr. Jeremiah did. Not because he had all the answers, because he finally asked the question nobody else asked. One conversation changed everything. A grandmother regained hope. A doctor discovered compassion beyond policy, and 2 lives moved forward stronger than before. Mirabel's greatest act was not surviving difficult circumstances. It was remaining faithful when nobody was watching. She stood guard over love, and in the end, love stood guard over her too. As the sun began setting over Oklahoma one evening, Mirabel and Dr. Jeremiah sat together with coffee in their hands. No hospital bench, no cold night, no uncertainty hanging over them, just peace. Mirabel looked toward him and smiled. "Life's funny." "How so? I thought I was losing everything." Dr. Jeremiah nodded. "And?" Mirabel lifted her coffee cup. "Turns out I was finding some things too." He smiled. Neither needed to say more. Some moments speak for themselves. Moral of the story is that never judge someone sitting outside a building. You may think they're lost. You may think they've given up, but sometimes they're standing watch over the person they love most. And that kind of love deserves respect. Before you go, please remember to like this video, share this story, leave a comment below, subscribe to Love, Money, and Secret, and tell us, who in your life would you stand guard for no matter how difficult things became?